I think there's something to be said for the sounds, the rather rustic sounds of making a podcast recording outside rather than choosing to be all refined inside of a studio. You might be thinking there's something to be said for how terrible it sounds. Whatever the case, this is just a brief response to Sam Harris's latest epic podcast on the topic of free will. Sam and I have both been engaged with making many remarks and many postings on this topic. Sam, of course, has written a book defending the thesis that free will does not exist, and I think that remains the best defence of that position. So, towards the beginning of the podcast, Sam seems to start by speaking about the feeling of free will. Now, this is consistent with the way in which Sam speaks about many other topics. Epistemology, for example, is often about belief or about confidence or about certainty. Morality is about the feeling of well-being or simply happiness or other kinds of emotions. I think that concentrating upon feelings and emotions when it comes to objective matters of truth can be misleading. It's not that feelings and emotions are entirely irrelevant to any of these discussions. And of course, our most valuable, important experiences as human beings certainly do come down to the way in which we feel about those experiences that we have. Joyful experiences are the most profoundly positive parts of our lives. Terrifying, saddening, rage-filled moments are among the worst kinds of experiences that humans can have. But I think because emotions are the very thing that cause us distraction moment to moment, are the things that occupy our minds moment to moment so often, it can cause some philosophers to see them as significant not only for the personal lives of human beings, but also objectively important in their own right, in the sense that they have significance not only for individual human lives, but for the way in which knowledge is created, what makes moral claims true or false, or indeed in this case, whether or not an abstract reality of free will exists or not. That it comes down to whether an individual has a perception of that particular thing or not, that particular concept or not. And that lacking that particular feeling, sensation or perception, or indeed experience of, let's say, free will in this case, would mean that the free will does not exist. That because you do not have the perception of free will, then therefore free will does not exist. I want to say that this is a kind of epistemological error, and it leads to an ontological error. It leads to one saying that therefore a certain thing doesn't exist by virtue of the fact one doesn't have an experience of it. Free will, to my mind, is not primarily about the experience, although I can defend the idea, and I have done so, that free will is an experience that one can have. So let's just flag that up front, that I think that just because someone searches for a thing X and fails to find it, does not mean that thing X does not exist. Okay, many religious people have made this claim with respect to atheists, that just because they, the religious person, cannot show you God, that does not mean God does not exist. Now, I'm an atheist, but I think it's a fair point that if your argument is just because you haven't found it doesn't mean that thing doesn't exist. So there are many such things in this category. Just an interlude which I've recorded after doing the rest of that podcast. It's one of these things where talking about these issues frequently enough, you tend to think certain things go without saying, but I think that this probably doesn't go without saying. But one example of something in this category where, of course, not one example of a thing in this category, many such things in this category, things which you don't have direct experience of, but which you know exist, is
just about everything in science. Just about everything of interest in science is not something that we have direct access to, not something that we can see, and simply saying you can't see that, you can't observe that, therefore it doesn't exist, would be a ridiculous non sequitur. For example, we do not see the Big Bang, but we know the Big Bang must have existed as an event. The Big Bang happened 13.7 billion years ago. We know that. But no one can see, no one can observe the Big Bang. What we observe is the cosmic microwave background radiation 13.7 billion years later. We observe the Hubble expansion of the universe, galaxies redshifted, moving apart one from another. We observe the ratio of hydrogen to helium. Okay. We don't observe, we don't see, no one has an experience of or a perception of dinosaurs. We have the experience of patterns in rocks that we call fossils. No one typically has the experience of actually observing atoms, but we know they're there. No one has the experience or will have the experience, even in principle, given what we know about science, of literally the fusion reactions taking place inside the sun right now that causes the light to fall upon the surface of the Earth. What we instead have is an experience of light falling upon the surface of the Earth, and then a very long chain of explanation stretching all the way from here at the Earth to the surface of the sun and then into the internal workings of the core of the sun. In other words, we explain the seen in terms of the unseen. We explain the observed in terms of the unobserved. So we need to keep that in mind as we move forward in this podcast, that either having an observation or not is not the thing which cashes out whether or not something is true in reality. The purpose of an observation is as a criticism of a particular theory. That's what observations do. And in the ideal case, we have two competing theories and the observations can decide between them. And when we talk about this free will issue, what we're going to have to decide is what is a good explanation, for example, of people's behaviour, because that's really what we're trying to figure out here. Why is it that people choose to do one thing rather than another? Now, we can try and deny the existence of free will, which I find rather synonymous with the capacity to create explanations. For reasons beyond the scope of what I'm saying here and now, there are various other links that I'll provide beneath the video, the YouTube version of this, to my other writings on this topic, where I suggest, following some of the things that are said in The Beginning of Infinity, that perhaps consciousness, free will, the creative capacity of human beings, all of this stuff, all quite mysterious, may be tied up together to be one single overarching mysterious quality, at the moment mysterious quality, of people that makes them qualitatively different to other animal species that exist on the planet. And one convenient way of talking is simply free will. Okay, so back to the main part of the podcast now.
Now, there are other reasons we might reject God, let's say, or supernatural beings. It's not merely on the basis that we can't find them, that we don't have evidence for them, but rather no explanation is improved by postulating their existence. And that's the reason ultimately that we dismiss certain entities as existing. If an entity is posited to exist but serves no explanatory purpose, then it's metaphysical baggage and we can do away with it. When it comes to free will, some people might claim that they have no experience of free will. Others might say that they do have an experience of free will and we're at loggerheads. We can only appeal to our internal subjective state. But free will stands apart from this claim. Free will is an explanation of what people do and why. And we will come to this. I've talked at length about this and written at length about this in various places. And I think the strongest argument that remains is that free will is this emergent, abstract concept. Now, abstractions have physical effects in the real world. This is shown by David Deutsch's wonderful Winston Churchill copper atom argument that appears in The Fabric of Reality. I've talked about that before elsewhere, and if I repeat it again now, it's going to be for about the 10th time. So I won't bore listeners with that again. Please see the other podcast linked to alongside of this one for the Winston Churchill copper atom argument. Now, Sam says that removing free will from our epistemology, our morality, or just broadly our philosophy means that we will no longer have a rational basis for hating people. But I think we can have free will and yet still have no rational basis for hating people. As we say, for those of us who subscribe to some of the ideas in the beginning of Infinity, what a person is an explainer, a special kind of explainer. They're a universal explainer. That essentially, I shouldn't say essentially, but what we can explain a person to be is an explanation generator. That's what they do. We model the universe, we try and figure out what's going on. We're a problem solver. There are many synonyms which all mean roughly the same thing, point in the same direction as to what a person really is. And given that description of what a person is, that explanation of what a person is, one need not hate other people. Even if people behave badly, if they have bad ideas, we can hate those ideas. We can direct our hatred towards particular ideas, but people should not be identified with the ideas they have. Now, Sam is an expert at having people think carefully about their inner state, their inner thoughts, their subjective experience of the world. In other words, what it's like to be conscious. And these thought experiments he attempts to reveal to the listener, or to the reader in some cases, that not only is free will an illusion, but that the entire concept of free will is a non-starter. It is incoherent from the get-go. Okay, so let me turn this around on Sam. I think that this is rather like arguing that cars don't exist. Now, this seems absurd, but of course, if you are somebody who subscribes to the notion of free will, if you think you really do have the sensation of free will and a professional philosopher says that you do not, then it can seem to be just as absurd to be told that free will is an incoherent concept. So I want you to reflect for a moment about how you get from A to B in the morning, let's say, as you go to work, and presuming you drive to work. So think about your journey. You're off to work in the morning and you go out into the garage or wherever the car happens to be parked and you start your engine. And you have an experience, what you think is an experience of the car taking you from your driveway along back streets and perhaps highways to finally ending up in the parking bay of your office or wherever your workplace happens to be. Now, to most people, this makes it seem like the car really has been the reason why you made it to work. But I want to say that there really is no place in reality for the car. There is no car. That was an illusion. The entire concept of the car is actually incoherent. In fact, all there has been, in terms of our not only scientific understanding, but your subjective sensation of what's going on, are combustion reactions, although in many cases are lithium-ion redox reactions if you've got an electric car at Tesla. It's basically the conversion of chemical energy of a kind into kinetic energy, matter undergoing transformations. To say that it was the car that got you from A to B is to ignore so much of what we know, both objectively as a matter of science and subjectively, what you're experiencing. What you're experiencing are the sounds. These are the sounds of combustion reactions or of chemical reactions. These are the sounds of chemistry becoming movement and emotion. We might even say that everything we know about chemistry and physics to this point tells us that something like the car isn't real. It's just a convenient way that some people have of speaking, but it's terribly misleading. In fact, it's worse than that. It's a lie, and it's a lie because the car itself is a fictional term invented by people labeling nothing that is truly there. And now, if you think I'm being facetious, I just want you to reflect on what we know about relativity, even Galilean relativity, because there is a deeper truth lurking here. And the deeper truth is that there is simply a continuum of matter between you and the rest of the universe. And relative motion tells us that it is just as reasonable to say that you remain stationary and the entire universe moved about you until you found yourself at point B. And this is the sense in which the car really is illusory and did not move you from A to B, and how trying to invoke it as a reason why you found yourself no longer at A but instead at B is to be hypnotized by a kind of history of superstitious thinking on this front. The car itself, indeed, didn't arise spontaneously. It hasn't always been there. It came from the earth via a long chain of causation. Okay, so perhaps I am lacking some generosity in the story I've just told about the car. But of course, I don't think that Sam has grappled with the idea of emergence or higher level causation, or possibly top-down causation. Things in the causal chain are still causes. Just because there are events prior to the goings-on in my mind does not mean that goings-on in my mind are not the reason for my behaviour. And a convenient way of speaking about this is to refer to the freedom of the will, in the same way that a convenient way, an almost unavoidably convenient way, to speak about how one gets from A to B is to say that the car was the way in which they got from A to B. None of this is to detract from the fact that I think that Sam does a very good summary and overview, even an explanation of the traditional debate as it's been had for centuries, certainly decades. But I must say that I do think Deutsch takes us beyond that. I've tried to explain this concept of emergence and the copper atom argument elsewhere. That if we want to explain why the copper atom is at the tip of the nose of Winston Churchill's statue in Parliament Square, we have to invoke these higher level concepts, this idea of war and culture and respect. These things are abstract, but they are real and they cause physical events in reality. And of course, what a person is, a person as a universal explainer, not grappling with any of this when dismissing something like free will, means the debate is stuck in the past, stuck some decades ago before these new philosophical and scientific understandings have been found and explained and explored. I think that the traditional way of framing the debate about free will in terms of determinism versus free will, or in terms of compatibilism in the traditional sense, is all coloured by a particular worldview, a different worldview. And that's not Sam's fault, it's not Daniel Dennett's fault, because that's the default. That's the way in which people have always thought about these ideas. Sam says in his podcast that you're not a self towards the end there. He says you're part of the stream rather than being separate to it. But you can be both. Failing to draw distinctions in the world is precisely the same error as the error of the person who says, well, it's not the car that gets you from A to B. After all, relativity says that there's no absolute motion, that one may as well say the universe is moving around you rather than you moving through the universe, or that trees don't exist, or that birds don't exist, because it's all just one unified whole of physical reality. Although that's true, we can still make meaningful distinctions, and one meaningful distinction is the existence of the self. Sam tries to use also this thought experiment about picking a film. That if you sit quietly, reflect, and think of your favourite film, He asks you to pause and really reflect on what that experience is like as a matter of subjectivity. Now, when I do this, of course, a random film will pop into my head, as it will to yours, because we've been given no other instructions other than pick a film, any film. Now, there is no good reason why we should pick any film, so it should be unsurprising when we don't find a good reason for picking a film, that it seems like a free choice for which there is no reason, because we've not been asked to provide one. But what does the picking? Well, what does the picking there is a mental coin flip. It is kind of random, and that doesn't mean that we do or do not have free will. It illustrates very little. But now I want you to try another kind of introspection. I want you to reflect and think not of a random film. I want you to think of the best film. And when I say the best film, I mean the film that you judge to be the best film. Think now, what's the best film? I've got one in my mind. Now, it's not so important what the film is, but what's important is the fact that I've said, what is the best film? And you will have criteria. Now, the criteria that you have may be you enjoyed it the most. It may be that it has been critically acclaimed the most, awarded the most. It may be a combination of all these things. It may have emotionally affected you the most. It may be something that is poignant because you grew up with it. There could be any number of reasons why you've picked that film. But you should have a reason for picking that film. It won't be simply an arbitrary, random choice. The experience of trying to come up with an explanation why that film is your best film, your choice for best film, is a very individual thing. It's a thing that reveals something about the existence of self, yourself, because it will be unique to you. Your reasons will not be like other people's reasons. Your film will not be like other people's films necessarily. The arguments that arise in order for you to explain, were you challenged why it's the best film, will be unique to you. You will create them on the spot, and that will reveal to you what you are. You're an explainer. You're someone who is able to generate some kind of creative piece of knowledge about what the best film is. This is a different experience. Now, Sam might want to say, but you're not choosing what those explanations are. And all I can say here is that we must differ on that point, because then what is doing the choosing, if not me? He might say, well, these ideas, these explanations are coming unbidden into your mind. Things have to stop somewhere. Should we expect an infinite regress? That if Sam already addresses this actually, that if I can't choose the explanations that arise in my mind, or the ideas that arise in my mind, I can't choose to choose the ideas in my mind either. That's all fair. What other alternative could there be? It has to stop somewhere, and it stops with you. And that stopping is actually where it originates. Ideas originate somewhere. They originate in your mind. They are a part of your mind. They're not identical to you. You are the thing doing the generating of the ideas. How does this work? We don't know. We don't have a fully fledged scientific theory of how ideas arise in the mind. If we did, we could write down a recipe for how this is done, an algorithm, and we could program computers to do it as well. We could have creative computers. But we can't do that yet. We don't know how ideas arise in the mind, but we know that they do. Ideas arise in the mind. They arise via a process of creativity in the minds of conscious people. How? We don't know. Now, is this a free choice? Yes, because you can choose not to think of anything if you want. You can choose to think of different things. Now, if someone says to you, don't think of a white elephant, of course you're going to think of a white elephant, But that's just to say there are various forces impinging upon our minds at any given time, one of which is the outside world and one of which are our own minds. And our minds are sort of attracted hither and thither towards the external world and towards an introspection upon our own subjectivity. We can do both because we're problem solvers. We both look outwards to solve problems about external reality and inwards about what's going on in our own minds. Now, Sam is quick to say that giving up on the notion of free will has great moral benefits, one of which is being free from feeling the need to hate others because you don't think that they're worthy of blame. Now, I already don't think that we need to hate people or that we need to, in any technical sense, blame the person. I have a subtle difference here. People do what they do because of the ideas that they hold. Now, there is some responsibility for holding the ideas that you have, and you should reflect upon your own ideas. And if you're not a reflective person, if you're not choosing to think about the ideas that you have, there's some culpability on your part for not being a reflective person. Of course, Sam might say, well, you don't get to choose to be a reflective person. There's all sorts of ways in which you might have been brought up due to luck, and so you're not blameworthy for not being a reflective person. And I can agree with this. But that still doesn't mean that if you are a reflective person, that if you do know you should be a reflective person and then choose not to be a reflective person, then you are somehow innocent of what I might say is the sin of choosing not to carefully consider your thoughts and actions. But the hazard here, the moral hazard that this entire worldview of free will doesn't exist introduces, that otherwise wouldn't be there, is that everything is reduced to luck. And Sam puts a primacy upon luck. He says that essentially there's good luck and there's bad luck. It's nothing to do with you and your choices because, well, ultimately it's not you that make the choices anyway. And of course you don't really properly exist as a self. All your efforts are about luck because you're lucky to be the kind of person to put in effort or not. This ends up having terrible moral consequences and terrible political consequences, because what it means is that lazy people are not ultimately responsible for their laziness. And so should you choose to be lazy, ultimately, well, it's not your fault. You can be lazy, you can choose to sit on the couch and do nothing at all, and indeed, we should all be quite compassionate about the fact that you've made that choice. We see that today more and more, and I think it's becoming really the prevailing view of how we should see one another in society. That everyone is, to a large extent, a victim of their circumstance. They're lucky. The wealthy people are merely, by good fortune, lucky, and the people who have very little are merely, by bad fortune, unlucky. There are many situations in which luck can explain rather a large amount of what is going on in people's lives. No doubt, people born in sub-Saharan Africa are unlucky. People born in California are, for the most part, rather more lucky by comparison. But two people brought up in roughly the same area, with roughly the same amount of wealth, who end up going on to make different choices, one of whom ends up wealthy, healthy, happy and wise, and one of whom ends up becoming a violent criminal. We should be able to explain this, not merely in terms of luck, but primarily and largely in terms of their choices and ideas, their efforts and the energies that they choose to put into their output and into their work. It comes down to who they are as people. Now, Sam makes a lot about Charles Whitman's tumour, which is supposed to be proof positive that hardware problems of that kind must always cause certain software problems. But what I want to say is that Charles Whitman had every chance to tell the police what he was going to do before he did it. There was nothing in the tumour that contained sufficient information to tell him not to warn the police about what he was doing or to self-isolate or anything else like that. That just because you have a compulsion to be violent does not mean that you must necessarily be violent. You can take steps to not be. Lots of people have the compulsion to do things that they shouldn't do and choose not to do it. It doesn't matter how strong the compulsion is. I don't understand that at all, really. Lots of people feel like they want to do bad things. Lots of people choose to do those bad things, and others with precisely similar emotions, feelings, sensations, proclivities choose not to because of the ideas that they have. The grizzly bear is raised, and the grizzly bear thought experiment is, well, the grizzly bear attacks you and you run away. So apparently you don't have any free will because you're fearful, while the grizzly bear also has no free will and is not blamed for attacking you, should not be blamed for attacking you. I agree, the bear should not be blamed for attacking you. The bear is a mindless creature, literally mindless in my worldview, I would suggest. And that is why, by the way, being literally mindless, it's not a moral agent. We can argue about whether or not, therefore, this means the grizzly bear not having free will, not having the capacity to create knowledge, to understand ideas, whether or not the bear is actually able to suffer in the sense that people can suffer. That's a whole other story. But in Sam's story about the grizzly bear attacking the person, there doesn't seem to be any way in which there is a distinction made, a fundamental distinction made between the grizzly bear and the person. That if neither of them has free will, then what is fundamentally the difference between the grizzly bear and the person? The grizzly bear is just doing what its genes tell it to do, to attack someone. And the person's just running away because it's fearful. Apparently the genes are telling the person to run away, so neither has free will. What's the difference? I sense that what Sam might want to say is something like, well, the person's more intelligent. That on the continuum of intelligence between amoeba, fish, squirrels, bears, higher apes and humans, the bear and the person aren't that different. They're just different in quantity of intelligence. I want to say there's a difference in quality. There is a black and white difference, an infinite difference. One can explain nothing about the universe. That's the bear. And one, in principle, can explain everything about the universe. That's the human, the person. This quality of being able to explain the world around you, to have experiences of the world around you and to incorporate them into a model of the universe around you, provides you also with the capacity to choose among different explanations. This capacity to choose, also known as free will, is what separates us from every other entity in the universe. This is what makes people categorically different. Sam talks about putting people in prison, that even if people don't have free will and so should not be blamed for the evil they do, nonetheless we need to put them in prison. Well, I couldn't agree more, and I agree with him on this point, that prison is not a place of retributive justice. It's not a place in order to punish people. It's a place, hopefully, to keep the rest of us safe from these violent people, and hopefully to rehabilitate these people, to change them into people who will not do violent harm to the rest of us. Ideally, that's what prison is about, so I agree with him on that. And then Sam segues into talking about compatibilists. And what he says compatibilists do is to kind of conjure Atlantis into existence and then point to Sicily and say that Sicily really exists. Well, this begs the question. He's essentially saying, first, recognise that Atlantis doesn't exist. It's a mythological island. Now, this is what free will is like. Well, no, not at all. What any compatibilist would say, contra to this point, is, do you know what? Look at Sicily over there. It really exists. Now, what you, Sam Harris, are doing is saying, that Sicily over there, that doesn't really exist. That's Atlantis. It's a mythological place. It never has existed. It's always been a part of myth, and you can point to it as much as you like, but and although everyone else thinks they have an experience of Sicily, it doesn't really exist. It's a mythological place. That begs the question as well. I don't think that Atlantis story gets us anywhere. Sam also says that compatibilists identify themselves with the totality of their thoughts or experiences. And this is false. I do not do this, and I think many others don't do this either. I am at pains to say that we have ideas. We are not identical to ideas. We are universal explainers. The fundamental quality of what a person is that we create, we generate explanations, we model the rest of reality around us. This is what we try to do. We try to understand stuff and comprehend stuff. Now, the particular things that we do comprehend, that's not what makes us us. It's the capacity to do that. So the particular ideas that we have at any given point in time doesn't make us us. It sort of helps to form our personality, but not our personhood. Our personhood is derived from our capacity to create ideas, rather than being identical to any ideas. So I'm not to be identified with the totality of my body or the totality of my thoughts. Sam says that you are no more responsible for the structure of your brain than your height. Okay, this is true as far as it goes, but the structure of your brain is not what makes you you. It's the structure of your mind. This is a category error. The difference is everything. We are not hardware, we are software, and the software is infinitely malleable. Now, I could get into that, I won't. Suffice it to say that in remarking that it's infinitely malleable, I'm not saying that it's easy to to change everything about your mind. It can be very difficult to change even small parts about your mind. And with 4 minutes to go in the podcast, Sam says that he wants to bring things back to direct experience. There's that phrase, the key phrase that permeates much of Sam Harris's philosophy. And I have great respect for Sam, but this appeal to direct experience is an error that has plagued philosophers for millennia. And Sam's error is the same as theirs. We do not have direct experience of the external world, and we do not have direct experience of our own mind. And this might seem too clever by half, but it's true. You interpret what is going on in your mind. You interpret your thoughts, and then you come up with an explanation of what's going on. And that can include something as naked as the experience of meditating and having the full experience of pure consciousness. And when you have that experience, it's merely an experience that must be interpreted and then turned later into words that you explain to other people. And no matter how clear, what kind of clarity you think you have in the moment, that is not a reason to say that therefore for certain that experience means something real exists in the universe. You need something more than that. You need a good explanation. And I'm giving you a good explanation about what the self is. The self is that thing which generates explanations. And you can switch that off at times, and when you do, you have the experience of not having a self. But that doesn't mean that you are not a self. It just means that for that moment, you're able to switch off your mind and not have any thoughts. And that's a different kind of experience. But it doesn't provide any deep insight into the true nature of reality. It's rather like switching off all the lights in your room, not seeing anything at all, and concluding on that basis that therefore the universe has literally disappeared. Of course it hasn't. And let's just end on the note that Sam is a great proponent of the mystery of consciousness. But the mystery of consciousness is perhaps as great a mystery as the existence of the universe itself, the existence of existence itself. But he dismisses the mystery of free will rather too quickly. And I think that these two errors are tied up together. I think that they're both mysteries, they're both very interesting topics to explore, and they might actually ultimately be the same. And I just want to observe that this is similar to how Daniel Dennett thinks that consciousness is kind of more easily understood than people think. But on the other hand, free will is rather easily understood. They're kind of mirror images of each other in this way. One thinking that consciousness is a deep mystery and the other not. One thinking that free will is a kind of interesting question and the other not. Jaron Lanier talks about this as well, about how when a philosopher denies one area of the mystery of the world, the other tends to crop up unbidden by them. So if you tend to dismiss the mystery of whatever the nature of time is, the nature of the self tends to crop up unbidden in your ontology. Okay, I think I've talked more than long enough about that for now. Until next time, bye-bye.